ARK Evolved. The first thing I wanted to do is to search for bad reviews about the game that are talking about the performance. Hence, this is a performance video with a lot of GPUs. I wanted to see if they are right. It's aside from that because he had barely 6 hours of gameplay, so I have more hours than him and I only tested the GPUs in the game. So I'm starting with the best, of course, the GT 420. Nothing can make this GPU run better, seriously. You know, even if everything is dropped down to 800 by 600, the GPU is struggling with the 10-11 frames. I'm not even bothering to improve it, so I'll just go to the next card because this is unfixable, seriously. Up next is the GT 430, starting with the best resolution, 800 by 600, the GPU with similar configuration like the previous one, 17-30 frames, but depending on the zone where you were walking. That is good because there is hope in this GPU. Still, you don't play a game like this that costs more than the GPU. Let's move on. The GT 440. With this one, I managed to set up the game a little better and I went for that 720p resolution. 20-30 frames with 40% render. That's a treat for this card. It's like playing ARK on a PS2 with 30 frames. Up next, it's the GTS 450. This is the last GPU that came to my collection, and this card actually made the whole series, 400 series, complete. So theoretically, this is the first game with that 400 series. In the game, it did okay, but the way I tested the game was with 1080p with half render resolution. You know what? Let's move on. GTX 460. Now with 460 on 1080p, the game did 30-40 frames with 40% render. Well, it's good because it's a cheap card and we can see other games in the future. Alright, let's move on to the next one, the GTX 465. On 1080p it had around 40 FPS, but the render was over 50%, almost 60% or something like that, making the first GPU that is, I should say, is making the game playable. Up next is the GTX 470 on 1080p on low with render exactly like the GTX 465. Well, at one point I saw even 50 FPS with this video card, so it's normal because this is a destructible map. The GTX 480. Now, similar with the rest of the cards on the setup, on 1080p it did very good, but I jumped the fence and went for the medium details. And guess what? It felt like a console with 30 FPS with some drops, but not very noticeable. Let's change the series and move on to the 500. I recently bought some cards that are missing from the series, so for the moment I will start with the GT 545. On 720p the GPU did almost like a console, pulling barely above 30 FPS, but there were too many drops under. Up next, it's the GTX 550. This is the Chinese version, the fake GTX 750. Until I get a legit one, this has to do it. On 1080p with low details, the GPU did very well. I forgot the renders setup that were in the game. You can clearly see it managed to hold up the game. Up next is the GTX 555. Let's see how this magnificent Alienware GPU is doing in the game. 1080p with render resolution dropped down to minimal is doing pretty well. What I wanted to see is what happens if I put everything to epic. It doesn't even get 10 FPS, so I feel sorry for the GPU and I stopped there. Let's move on to the next GPU, is the GTX 560. Now this GPU clearly shows that it can hold up its ground with the FPS. The resolution for this GPU was 1080p and the render in the setup was nearly half. Alright, up next is the GTX 580. First I wanted to go with low details with this 580, but seeing that it's passing 60 FPS I went for medium details. I want to say I'm surprised, but I'm not. This is a very awesome option if you're planning on getting a cheap GPU that can hold the game like this. Next is the GTX 590. There are two things that can be wrong with this video card. Either the game doesn't have support for this card as an SLI or multi-core support, or either one core is dead. It's got exactly the same FPS like the GTX 580. So right, let's move on. Apparently there is someone subscribed to my channel who likes this video card. The GT 640 on 1080p with just a little under 50%, I think it was near 40% on render resolution. The GPU managed to pull some decent frames. The only thing good about this GPU is that it doesn't need 12 volts supplementary voltage. Let's move on to the next GPU, the GTX 650. This card managed to die, but I had the opportunity to record some games with it, so ARK ARK is one of them. On 1080p with half render resolution, the GPU performed pretty well, making it a very good option for a cheap GPU, just in case you're looking for an option like this. Let's move on to the GTX 670. With this GPU, I started the game on 1080p with low details, and oh boy, did those 4 gig of DDR manage to help in this case. After a short time, I switched to medium, and hey presto, it works wonders. If this GPU doesn't minimally satisfy the FPS for this game, then you want to play the game with the wrong GPU. This is my opinion. Let's bring up my bestie, the GTX 780. So by now, obviously it will work nice on low, but how about the epic settings? I understand it doesn't work. Let's just stay on epic and drop the render resolution to minimal. Almost feel like a console, seriously, a pretty console. I dropped the quality from epic to high and the FPS started to get some shape, but still it feels very sloppy. So at this point I decided to not recommend any GPU that I have if you want to play the game on max. Alright, let's move on to the red Steam. I started the test with HD 7950. Now the card on medium global settings managed to do as I expected. It was hovering around 40-50 FPS with 60 FPS maximum. Alright, up next is the potato GPU, the HD 6770. The only thing good about this card is that half backplate, because the performance was kinda sloppy on 720p on low with nearly half render. It barely managed to pull that 30 FPS. But wait, the next GPU, the HD 7750, for my surprise the GPU was working on 1080p with low details around 24-26 FPS. I was thinking that the GPU is trying to give us a cinema look. So up next is the last GPU that I've tested, is the R7 260X. On 1080p with low details the GPU was doing around 60 FPS, but the question is, does it run good on medium? Well, the GPU managed to perform pretty well. So at this stage I can say that either you play with 30 FPS with a decent quality or drop down the quality for more frames. Thank you for watching. Make sure you smash that like button. Peace out.